I'm Adrienne Klasa, Development Finance Editor of The Banker. I'm here in Miami at SWIFT's Latin America Regional Conference, and I'm here with Gabriel Casillas, who is Chief Economist and Investor Relations Officer at Banorte. So first of all, we just did a panel on geopolitics, and I'm wondering if you could talk to me about the main takeaways from this panel, focusing on Latin America.
In my personal point of view, the three main takeaways were, number one, Latin America have seen some disappointing years in terms of growth, particularly in Brazil, but I mean in general. Thankfully, you're getting out from that. Also, we're seeing better growth rates. Unfortunately, number two, we have two things. Number one, the US Fed hiking rates in a less gradual fashion. So usually when the Fed does a rate hiking cycle, there's a crisis in EM, and in Latin America, for sure, it has been no exception in this context. Nevertheless, number three, I think that very important to highlight the macroeconomic structure of the majority of countries in Latin America has been strengthened. So even though this latest wave of volatility has now do a little bit of damage to particular countries, at least the zone remains quite well. But on the other hand, we're experiencing a lot of elections in 7 countries. So in this context, the political climate is how to dodge the populist bullet. That's the main idea. Colombia is doing right now. After the first round, we'll have the second round in a few weeks. In the case of Mexico, we'll have elections very soon, and then Brazil, in which the candidate that actually is getting the electoral preferences is in jail, Lula da Silva. So let's see, very interesting topics, but the three main takeaways I think are those, and trying to round them up. I think that in the medium term, at least, one thing is this macroeconomic structure that has been strengthening on the one hand, and the other is that, at the end, the world is growing at its fastest rate since the crisis, and in a synchronized way. Very few countries are in a recession. So in this context, with more robust institutions and high growth in the world, it seems that we're going to go well.
Let's dig in a little further to one of the elections that you mentioned. So Mexico's elections are coming up very, very shortly. The front runner of the polls by a wide margin is a leftist candidate known colloquially as AMLO. What will his presidency, if it comes to pass, mean for the financial sector in the country?
And of course, it makes a lot of sense to talk about him since AMLO is the one that is leading the polls with a wide margin, as you mentioned. However, there are more days to come, and in politics, everything is possible. Still, the other two candidates are there, So in this context, even though the outcome is not yet known, a lot of people is very pessimistic about an AMLO presidency because a lot of people compare him to Venezuela and Hugo Chavez. In my personal point of view, I don't think that's the case. Two main differences. Number one is, even though the rhetoric in the electoral process seems similar, AMLO has not been in the military. And second, Chavez never governed anything before becoming president. And AMLO actually was the mayor of Mexico City, that it's actually the most important governor of the country. And he did it quite well. So in this context, I'm not on the catastrophic side of issues. So I think he's going to be more like a pragmatic person, even though during the elections he's using a little bit more disruptive rhetoric. So in this context, what I think is that he's going to be respectful of macroeconomic stability, starting, of course, with the autonomy of the central bank, but more so on being a responsibly fiscal person. And in terms of the two most disruptive issues that he has been raising, like saying no to the new airport of Mexico City, or reverting the structural reforms that have been recently approved, particularly the education reform and the energy reform, I don't think, on the one hand, that he will finally do it, because at the end they will help the country. We're getting investments because of that, and who's going to say no to new investments and money and things that are going to boost up growth rate? And the second, it's about power in the legislative processes. In this context, even though AMLO might get simple majority in Congress and the Senate, I don't think he's going to get the super majority you need to really change the Constitution. And change the Constitution, then you will be able to revert the reforms because they are at the constitutional level. So having said that, I think that there could be some positive surprises coming out from an AMLO presidency if he wins.
We're seeing a ramp up of possible trade wars and actual real trade wars globally. We just saw sort of tariffs being imposed by Mexico on U.S. goods in retaliation to U.S. tariffs being imposed and the renegotiation of NAFTA. Looking further ahead, can trade barriers turn into financial barriers?
That's a very good question. I mean, honestly, right now, all geopolitical risks, it seems that, or most of them, are related to producing some kind of inflationary pressure in the U.S. and then suddenly make the U.S. Fed to hike rates at a less gradual fashion. No? It goes with the tax reform in the U.S., it goes with protectionism barriers, even with the nuclear pact with Iran. So that's why we have put so much focus on what the Fed will do and how it will affect markets. Having said all this, in terms of financial barriers, I will separate between two. On the one hand, like flow of capital in terms of equity, bond investments, I don't think that will cause those kind of financial barriers at all. What we are a little bit more concerned is about the other part of barriers, like more on the real side of investment, as well as on like cross-border transactions. Not on financial instruments, but more opening up accounts or those kind of things. We have already faced that. With the legislation in the U.S. becoming more restrictive with respect to like anti-money laundering policies and so on and so forth, it's become very difficult for cross-border transactions that are not related to financial instruments. So in this context, we have already faced that. No? Now, in terms of the other part, that it's real FDI, foreign direct investment, we haven't seen those. We have seen a little bit, for example, in some cases, the U.S. mentioning things of national security, not allowing a foreign company to own a particular company in the U.S. We have not faced that in Mexico, but we might face those, definitely. That could be some sort of problem that if the aggressiveness of these trade policies continue to happen, we might see that happening. Nevertheless, that's completely different of the other financial barriers with respect to financial instruments that we don't see those coming.
Gabriel, thank you so much for speaking to us.
On the contrary, thanks very much. Appreciate it.